Hello, and thank you for tuning in. I'm Shuit, and in this episode, I will be talking about community and play in an age of COVID 19 and social distancing. The reason I'm talking about this today is because I feel like the state of community, the state of play, has been somewhat fragmented due to the policies that have been put in by various governing bodies like the CDC, World Health Organization, the WHO, and whatnot. And I mean, these are obviously for good reasons. In order for us to not, get the virus and whatnot. So social distancing and quarantining ourselves. These are all ways that we can create barriers, but also physically keep ourselves from getting the virus. So I think we all know that, community and play is part and parcel of who we are as human beings. I remember a while back, this idea of the social animal was like a very popular concept. I remember authors like David Brooks, and David Brooks wrote a book called The Social Animal. And this was not written at the time, but I remember Alasdair MacIntyre had a book on this concept of the social animal, and he sort of looked at intelligent animals like dolphins and elephants and whatnot, and I'm guessing that was sort of to do a comparative analysis of just where we fit in this sort of animal kingdom, I guess. That is, if you choose to consider yourself an animal. I personally don't subscribe to that concept. I don't think I wouldn't call myself an animal, just because I believe I was created in the image of God, just like it says in Genesis, in the first chapter of Genesis. And so I don't necessarily consider myself an animal, just because that term animal has a lot of connotations that don't seem to be very positive. But I can understand where people are, where researchers or biologists or evolutionary biologists may find that term to be adequate, in the sense that we're flesh and bone, just like animals are flesh and bone, and so therefore we have something in common, and we can understand ourselves better by comparing ourselves to other animals. I just don't necessarily find that to be a very adequate way of understanding who I am and whatnot. And I don't necessarily think that we need to compare ourselves to animals and to their intelligence, whatever their intelligence might be, in order for us to gain insight into exactly the nature of our own intelligence and whatnot. I remember Thomas Sowell had this joke. Somebody had asked him what he thought about some random topic, and he said, compared to what? I guess economists, are, famous for wanting to compare things and whatnot. And he had this joke where somebody went up to an economist and said, "How are you doing?" And he said, compared to what? Compared to what, or compared to whom? I can't remember. But this idea that we always need to be comparing in order to get to the to really understand the dynamics of what we have. I can understand in certain, behavioral sciences that might be important, but for me, it just doesn't seem to be it doesn't seem to be necessary. I think we can understand ourselves in terms of, scripture and whatnot. And I'm not a fundamentalist in that sense, but I just I don't see any commonality between me and animals. This idea that that we are social beings, that we are created to be, in community and to play with one another is is basic to who we are as human beings. Even when we look at the second chapter of Genesis, and God creates Eve out of the rib of Adam. And so it just shows you to what degree we are actually interconnected and dependent on one another. In this concept called social capital, which when I had heard the concept, I had actually thought it meant, the degree to which we are sort of, wealthy in the context of relationships and the depth of our relationships, the quality of our relationships. That's what I had initially thought of what that meant, social capital. But social capital means more so the actions that we take, and I guess based on the ability for us to perform these actions and these behaviors, which are socially approved, and that strengthen the bonds with others in this global network of human beings. That the ability to do that means that we have currency, that we have social capital, I believe. And basically the nature of, we can't basically live on our own. Our well-being, our happiness is dependent on other people as well. And this was something I thought that was pretty striking. This here is my own reflection, so I don't have any data to back this up, but it is interesting. It's an interesting concept to think that my well-being is not really determined by the quality of the food that I eat, or staying intellectually active and whatnot, but it's really the nature of our well-being, the quality of our well-being is really dependent on how strong the bonds are that we have with each other. I'm sure many of you have seen the TED Talk that was by Robert Waldinger, I believe. This TED Talk was actually shot in Brookline, Massachusetts, and the title of the TED Talk was "What Makes a Good Life? Lessons from the Longest Study on Happiness." So this was a longitudinal study that was done by Harvard University over, I think it might have been generational also, that it followed a couple generations of people, but it also followed people from when they were children all the way up until old age. And the finding was basically that the quality of the bonds, the quality of the relationships that they had with others really determined the quality of their lives. I think, anecdotally, I think we all have stories of just like the joy and the difference in the quality of our lives that we have when we, spend time with our families and with our friends and loved ones and whatnot. So it kind of rings true. And it also seems like it's something we could have, validated on our own. I know neuroscience has is really popular these days, and so is science and, scientism, and this sort of, this belief that science is the end all be all and whatnot. But, I feel like neuroscience or science in general can really just, it's a very young discipline and whatnot, which started, I believe, in the 17th century as far as like physics and whatnot. Again, there was always contemplation in numbers, Pythagoras, the pre-Socratics, and, so it's not to say that math and science were never really, a part of, part of just human civilization. Obviously they were, engineering and all these types of things, but it's just the transformation from natural science or natural philosophy, into science was a change that happened in the 17th century. And then, of course, Galileo and Copernicus and, a whole host of other, famous mathematicians. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that, science can really affirm what it is that we would pretty much already know. I don't see, unless it's like studying something that's non-human, like that's not a human science. For example, if you're studying the universe or the earth, geology or astronomy or whatever. But when you're dealing with human beings, human behavior is very repetitive, almost predictable. And so, I don't really see neuroscience, blowing our minds with like some insight, or psychology, with some insight into the way human beings behave. Now, of course, this is big for, businesses and stuff with data and stuff. If you can understand kind of the various habits of human beings, you're able to really manipulate kind of how and when they purchase. You can probably time your sort of marketing strategies or whatever, accordingly. Just nudging people in certain directions and whatnot. But I don't see science as, or psychology or neuroscience as really blowing our minds with things that we didn't really intuitively really understand. This kind of makes us think, is thought really progressive, in that sense, like just because, Plato was, lived thousands of years ago, that somehow by definition of having lived 1,000 years ago, that determines the quality of his thought. And then you have, recent philosophers like, I believe his first name was Alfred North Whitehead. His first name was Alfred, and middle and last names were North Whitehead. And he had said that all philosophy is a footnote to Plato. And so that's a very interesting statement, that, nothing, not necessarily that nothing surpasses Plato, but, everything is really just a commentary on the thought of Plato. And so, with us being, social animals and whatnot, I think this is really something intuitively that we all understand, that we are meant to live in community and to play with one another. I think when we look at also the example of feral children, I know anyone who has children, as I recently learned, I don't have any children, but as I recently learned, that skin-to-skin contact is, very essential and very critical for children. And I think this is something that, scientists and researchers really learned about feral children, and just how critical touch is, to the development of children. I know in an Eastern European country. I can't remember what country it was, but there was talk about how there was orphanages that were very neatly kept, and the children had clothing and food and shelter and whatnot, but because the level there wasn't a very good level of intimacy that was shown to the children, and that there just wasn't really a lot of love or affection or intimacy that was shown to them. So that ended up really jeopardizing their health and their well-being. I think I remember hearing about cases of death as well in the children. And when you don't look, if we look at, certain cases of feral children, like with the instance of Jeannie in California, I remember another case of a child who, I can't remember his name, but they said he was like sort of raised by wolves, that he just lived in the forests and whatnot, and that all he could do was really screech. He couldn't really he wasn't socialized, so he couldn't talk. He didn't know language or anything like that, so it was just really screeching. And that's what feral kind of means, kind of mimicking or imitating animal behavior and whatnot. And so when we see certain cases like that, those two cases, for example, it just shows you to what degree isolation can really affect the health, the happiness, and the well-being of individuals. And with Jeannie in particular, it probably might be the most famous story that we know of. Perhaps it's just because it was recent. There was a lot of ethical or unethical things that happened. The researchers ended up adopting Jeannie just so they could study her more, which is something that wouldn't really fly today, but did back in, I can't remember the year, perhaps 80s or 90s, I can't remember, probably the 90s. But, and then they ended up sort of disowning her after a couple of years, I believe. So there was a lot of really unethical things that happened. But I think perhaps we have, so much footage and so much information about that case too here in the States. But we just see, a child who's left, even if you give them food, shelter, and clothing, if there's really no socialization, no civilization, in the sense like no way for the child to become civilized, then we see that it's, there's no miraculous thing that happens. They just really end up developing in isolation, and that developing in isolation really damages who they are in irrevocable or irreversible ways. So, as they grow older, it's not something that they're able to really undo. They're living their lives with that, I don't want to call it handicap, but they're living their lives with that undeveloped sense of being that they have, I guess. Which is the case, for all of us. We're all living with the tools that we picked up. Some tools might not really be that helpful. Some are probably counterproductive, to who it is that we want to be. But it's really up to us to kind of let go or discard these tools and pick up tools that are really helpful. And pick up the resources that are very helpful for us, that can, help us live healthier lives and whatnot. And psychology has a whole host of these resources. Our own Christian tradition has a whole host of resources, such as like ascetic practices and whatnot, giving up things, that are unhelpful for us. Evagrius Pontus says, that's his whole idea of asceticism, is that it's not really kind of flagellating the self or, your being, your person. Excuse me. But it's really about giving up those things that get in the way from us, that get in the way of us achieving stillness, or Hezekiah, that anything that gets in the way of us achieving this stillness and this peace, those are the things we have to discard. And it's very basic what those things are, like certain foods, certain people, certain places, that these things can get in the way of us achieving peace and stillness. And they don't have to be necessarily physical things, but perhaps not praying, engaging in chatter that's not really edifying and whatnot. So there's a whole host of resources in the Christian tradition. Breathing is an aspect in the Christian tradition. I know in the Eastern Orthodox Church, saying the Jesus prayer as you're breathing is a helpful way of praying. And modern clinical psychology also says the same thing, although they take their sort of this idea of meditation and breathing from the Buddhist traditions. It's nevertheless saying the same thing, that as you breathe, and they might include mantras and whatnot, but for us as Christians, I think existentially, we should probably be praying the Jesus prayer and whatnot. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner, or a variation of that, or any type of arrow prayer, as those prayers are called. But yeah, so it's all about developing the resources that we have, and this is part. It's community and play. It's more than just feeling good. Say you're having a stressful day and then you want to call a friend, or you want to hang out with friends or family and whatnot, but it's really at the very core level, almost in literally a physical way, it's that healing for us, that essential for us and whatnot. And I guess I also wanted to talk about this idea of community and play also, because I think it has been jeopardized a little bit just with the policies that I had alluded to earlier, like, quarantining ourselves, remaining socially distant from others. And I don't think that social networks like Facebook and whatnot really do much to help us, remain social. It's funny, they don't help with connection, but they help probably with like reconnecting us with people that we've haven't seen in years and whatnot. It's just very easy to reconnect with people through Facebook. But to connect with people, it's a very isolating experience, And again, I use Facebook, so I'm not really speaking in a negative way about Facebook. But the way in which I use Facebook is not the how should I say this? That I also understand that I have to find my community and I have to play with my community, despite having a Facebook account or whatnot. Which is, I think, something that we have to understand. Or that is good to understand, that you can have a Facebook account, but just it's all about balance. The middle road, not really straying off to the extremes, but balance and measurements. These are just good rules of thumb to have as you go through life. But but it's interesting how the internet has become a very with more people staying home during the pandemic, as means of work or entertainment or whatnot, the internet and like tech itself has become a very profitable industries, are very profitable industries, but also just profitable in general. They've become profitable, buying the various types of gadgets, and whatnot. So it does go to show you that tech and everything like this became the go-to because of the fact that we weren't able to really socialize with one another and whatnot. I also wanted to talk about this idea of the American paradox. Now, this was the title of a book, and the complete title was The American Paradox: Spiritual Hunger in an Age of Plenty by David Myers. And here he was talking about how, money is not, or the paradox is that we can live in a place with an abundance of material wealth and money and whatnot, but that, the paradox is that we are still spiritually hungry nevertheless. And this paradox, I know this talk was initially about the fragmentation of our social fabric during COVID-19, but I also wanted to reflect on this topic too, because it does have to do with happiness and whatnot, and how happiness is not in money and whatnot. And the litmus test, I think, for many of us, we think of lottery winners, right? We think, well, if I only had enough money, this is kind of our the voice, what we tell ourselves, that only if I had enough money, I would be happy, right? So then, for scientists, it's like, okay, well, let's look at lottery winners, because they have enough money, and yet are they happy with the money they have? And what they found was that there's a slight bit of happiness after they've won the lottery, but months later, their level of happiness is below average, below the average level of happiness that the general population has as well. So that just goes to show you that, happiness is nowhere to be found in money. And again, I'm probably going back to that Harvard study, that it's really the nature, the quality, the depth, the breadth of our, relationships and friendships with one another that seems to determine exactly what that seems to determine our happiness. So these are some of the things that came to mind as I was reflecting. This is perhaps I'm a bit late making a video on such a topic, just because this the pandemic and quarantines and social distancing we're still doing, but the quarantine and whatnot, at least here in the Pacific Northwest, was really something that happened perhaps late 2019, early 2020. But I just, I think there's a lot more, I'm able to see it a lot more clearly. I think that that kind of the effect that this has had on us, and I am an American, and so I understand the culture here in America is it's a lot more independent than it is perhaps, say, in Ethiopia or other countries that are where the the society really values or emphasizes communal ways of living and whatnot. But I just really see that, with the kind of with the way American culture has been, as far as being independent, self-reliant, entrepreneurial and whatnot, that with social distancing, once the pandemic came about, it really, really affected us, perhaps in ways that it probably didn't affect other communities and whatnot. Now, this is just my speculation, of course, but in communities where there is a value on, connection, and by connection I mean, group, sort of communal kind of gatherings and whatnot that are a regular part of the culture. It's easy for us in those kind of cultures to really depend on one another. But I think in America it might be, a little bit more difficult, I'd say. So yeah, I'm standing with a foot in, in each world, kind of just trying to see how, how it actually is. But that would be my guess, that it's easier for people of communal cultures to really get through, something like a pandemic, whereas it might be harder for individualized or societies that really emphasize, individuality, to really get through hard times. But anyways, this was my my conversation for today. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. Please like and subscribe, share, and I will see you guys in the next video. Have a good afternoon.